I think I'm ready. If everybody can hear me, I will begin. And I will start by saying welcome to everybody. Greetings to everybody. And thank you for coming today, this morning, this afternoon, this evening, whatever it might be. My name is Merrill McBride, also known as Merrill Johnson, professor of geography, retired, Colorado State University, Fort Collins. I'm a political and economic geographer by training, though in the last 2 decades I have spent much of my research time looking at the relevance of social virtual worlds to geographers. Today, however, I want to focus on political geography and the meaning of the boundary. At an earlier Science Circle meeting, I was quizzed informally about boundaries related to some current event. And being a political geographer, I had no trouble holding forth, indeed, ad nauseum. It occurred to me that, strangely, a Science Circle talk on boundaries might be interesting and relevant. How many major global political controversies have a boundary issue embedded within them? Probably most of them. The humble boundary has a vexing presence in the world in which we live. The purpose of my talk is to examine the meaning of the territorial boundary, the types of boundaries that are drawn, how boundaries are constructed, and how these little lines on the map can have such long-term disruptive effects. To illustrate my remarks, I focus primarily on Africa, though I will make reference to other boundary issues along the way. In general, when we think of a boundary, we think of a boundary as a line on the map that separates something. Of course, our vernacular expressions apply all sorts of other meanings to the word boundary, both geographical and not so geographical. We can think of a boundary in terms of limits, as in, his behavior knows no boundaries, or as some sort of inflection point, as in, she made a decision that crossed the Rubicon. Our general understanding of boundaries is correct, but for political geographers like me, the meaning is more nuanced. As a way of helping our understanding of the boundary concept, let's refer to a theoretical or mythical country called Amoeba. Its reticular coordinates are shown on the screen, which should be taken with a grain of salt. Amoeba shows the basic political geographical components that historically have been used as starting points for understanding the spatial structure of the state. Within amoeba, we have the core region, that area of maximum functional intensity. Countries may have multiple cores depending on the function. For example, a political core like Washington, D.C., a financial core like New York, a steel-producing core like Pittsburgh, an entertainment core like Hollywood, even a gambling core like Las Vegas, or, near and dear to my own heart, a food core like New Orleans. The capital city is shown in amoeba as part of the core, but in reality can be located in multiple areas in response to an array of factors in play. For example, Canberra, Australia is a political compromise capital, and some countries have multiple capitals, like, for example, Bolivia or the Republic of South Africa. The ecumene indicates that part of the state that is spatially and functionally unified with the core, and derives from a Greek word referring to the inhabited part of the world. The concept is increasingly irrelevant to the 21st century, as most countries are unified spatially and functionally, though of course not necessarily politically. Remnants of this term are seen today in discussions of religious, ecumenical, or unifying movements. The settlement frontier is, again, increasingly obsolete in the 21st century. with the concept's emphasis on the country's territory that is not spatially and functionally integrated with the core. We can think of America's Old West here. Thanks largely to technology, even the most unpopulated parts of the world, as for example, northern Canada, are tied to the core in one way or another. Finally comes the boundary, the subject of our interest, and it surrounds and contains these other geographical parts, and actually involves even more, which leads to the nuanced definition that I referenced earlier. Geographers view a boundary in terms of the multiple processes and characteristics in play, which include the boundary as a limit. The boundary provides a limit precisely defined of a country's sovereignty or the space over which the country has exclusive and ultimate control, at least in theory. What we often do not think about, and here's the nuance, is that these limits are spatially scalable. For example, we may start with limits on a personal scale, that space next to us that we guard and protect. Each person has a personal space envelope over which we claim sovereignty that travels with us and that we don't want violated by others. There's an implicit do not enter sign at the edge of the envelope. The size varies depending on age. A baby has no real envelope. Culture. Some cultures are more standoffish than others and keep the envelope large. And setting. Early studies showed, for example, that men standing in line to see a pornographic movie at a theater, like men do that anymore, tended to huddle close together to increase their anonymity to those walking by. We all walk around with our own envelopes, nudging people away when necessary. In my political geography class, I start the term by picking two students and asking one to approach the other until the other says, "Stop." I have to be careful, of course, not to choose the most flirtatious girl and ask her to close in on a male hunk. I then talk with students about how we have identified a primal boundary form. So, as an aside, let me ask the members of this gathering, how big is your envelope? What's in your envelope? It is a short step to move from personal space limits to corporate space limits. In other words, to corporate boundaries. Now we have groups of people defining and controlling their sovereign domains. Once again, it is all scalable. A group may be a family declaring that the home is its castle. Local gangs are known for protecting their turfs. Businesses try to control sales territories. In each case, there is a boundary of some sort. Ultimately, the desire to define and control space rises to the country level as the state draws a line marking the limit of its control or sovereignty. The boundary has a binding function. At least theoretically, everything within the boundary is bound together, creating, still theoretically, a homogeneity of state ideas, like reasons for being, of legal systems, of value traditions, of social mores, of cultural values, and even of spelling etiquette and of proper cuisine. No true American, for example, will be caught spelling color as Colour. Noah Webster had single handedly ensured the homogeneity of a nationalist American spelling by the time of his dictionary in 1828. And of all the great contemporary horrors, American attempts at homogeneity would certainly be shattered if the country normalized sprinkling vinegar but no salt on French fries like their Canadian neighbors do. And yes, I spelled neighbors the correct way. The boundary has a barrier function. Americans must stop vinegar at the border, which leads to this third characteristic. The boundary has historically served as a wall or moat against outside perils. The barrier function may be the most commonly understood attribute of the boundary, and perhaps the one leading to the greatest political instability in the world. When armies cross the boundary, it is war. The boundary is a plane. When most of us see a boundary, it is a line on a map. In reality, a boundary is a plane that descends below the surface of the earth, which becomes a problem for mining and for control of resources that flow, and rises into the heavens. Well, not quite all the way into the heavens. Obviously, a state's sovereignty does not extend to infinity and beyond. The U.S. cannot claim sovereignty over that portion of the moon that lies directly overhead. So where does the boundary end vertically? While there remains some discussion regarding this question, most observers and the United States acknowledge what's called the von Karman line, ever since the late 1950s, actually, which lies at roughly 100 kilometers or 62 miles or 330,000 feet in altitude as the boundary's limit. This is the altitude at which aircraft cease to have the lift to make them aircraft, and is where space begins. Not all boundaries are created in response to the same factors. In fact, boundaries, while always a line on the map, can be quite different in terms of provenance and purpose. Let's look at general boundary types. For genetic boundaries, it's all about when the boundary was created and the human circumstances surrounding its creation. There are several variations on the genetic boundary theme. Antecedent boundaries are drawn prior to human settlement. That sounds simple enough, but what is meant by human? There is a long and generally sad history of creating boundaries that are antecedent only in terms of European humans. A shining example of this presumption is the 49th parallel west of the North American Great Lakes, which was agreed to by the United States and Britain in 1818, and then through the Oregon Territory of to the Pacific Ocean in 1846. You can see that on the projected period map. It is correct to point out that there was little European settlement in the original area, making the boundary antecedent. We must also admit that there was abundant indigenous settlement that was split up, and the U.S. government knew about this, making the boundary not truly antecedent. As historians are given to say in a moment of rhetorical excess, oops. If the boundary is not antecedent, then it is subsequent. A subsequent boundary is laid down after settlement has occurred in the area. How the settlement is treated is important in understanding what kind of subsequent boundary exists. If the boundary makers completely disregard the existing settlement of people and any pre-existing natural and/or cultural boundaries, then we have a subsequent superimposed line. This is generally bad news for the original settlement, and more about this in a minute when I introduce Africa. If the boundary decision makers take into account pre-existing lines and or cultural boundaries, then we have a subsequent consequent boundary. The good intentions notwithstanding, few consequent boundaries are clean, and some superimposition is inevitable. The British learned this lesson the hard way in the late 1940s when they appointed a London barrister named Sir Cyril Radcliffe to oversee the creation of a line separating Muslim Pakistan from Hindu India. He used majority religious affiliation at the district level as his main criterion. 10 to 15 million people were displaced, and perhaps as many as 2 million people died as a result of this consequent boundary. Much to the consternation of the British and to the world, consequent intentions led to superimposed outcomes. Why not just let Mother Nature draw the boundaries? In other words, why not use a geomorphic boundary? This seems like such a simple solution to dividing space. For example, a river looks like a natural boundary. It's already a line on the map. How convenient. Of course, that line on the map becomes an area close up. You don't wade across a line, which is why rivers have long been coveted for their defensive moat functions. On the other hand, rivers, both banks, are often gathering areas for cultures. A boundary splits the culture area, and the groups occupying the two separate banks may find it difficult to interact with each other and may start to evolve differently. Also, over the long term, rivers have notoriously unstable water courses, especially in flat areas where lateral erosion is predominant. The meanders that form can become cut off, which at least in theory may take land from one country and give it to its neighbor, as indicated in the displayed graphic. So what happens then? The good news is that the affected parties often negotiate a solution. Mountains offer an equally mixed bag. Yes, a nice mountain range can provide a wall protecting a country. Switzerland offers a good example with the Ural Range along its northern boundary, containing elevation slightly greater than 5,000 feet, and the Swiss Alps along its southern border, producing massive barriers that exceed 15,000 feet. Invading armies would find it difficult to fight their way through strongly defended passes in the Swiss core to the Mittelland. Ask the Nazis. Although there were other reasons besides geography that helped Switzerland to remain neutral during World War II, maybe France was simply an easier target. Chile and Argentina have not always been on the best of terms. Think the Chilean tilt toward the UK during the Falklands War. The 20,000-foot peaks in the Andean ranges that separate the two countries give additional life to the proposition that good fences make for good neighbors. The major downsides of mountains focus on where precisely to locate the line, competition for watersheds, and, of course, the potential to split mountain cultures. Finally, the easiest and most convenient boundary type is the geometrical boundary. The boundary maker simply picks a line of latitude or longitude and declares it to be the boundary. This convenience may also be a reflection that the boundary maker may not have any idea what the territory contains, or even worse, may not care. The 49th parallel is not only an antecedent boundary, but a geometrical boundary, and the line was definitely convenient in the way that it separated British and American interests. By the way, my home state, Colorado, is bound completely by lines of latitude and longitude. You can see that on the map. A shape called by possibly questionable and slightly deranged sources as a hexahecta enecon takai heptagon. I'm glad that such a word is not in the state motto. Boundaries or boundary decisions can have stunningly disruptive effects on people and their settings, cultural and otherwise. It is interesting to look across the world and note how many current crises and illogical political geographies have roots in past boundary making. Let's take a brief look at the African continent as an example. Africa was of interest to European colonial empires since the late 15th century, with Portugal leading the charge initially. We can, however, identify two phases of interest. The first phase focused on Africa as a source of slaves and, of course, marks one of the most inhumane periods in human history. The geography of the first phase involved mainly coastal settlements by Europeans in the form of nodes and coastal strips, with relatively little interior penetration. The Great African Interior Plateau, a barrier. Disease and resistance by local groups made such penetration undesirable, and the profit from the slave trade made such penetration unnecessary. The second phase, phase two, appeared in the late 1800s and was largely set into motion by the Berlin Conference of 1884-85. By the mid-1800s, European powers were moving from their coastal enclaves and looking seriously at the interior of Africa. Motivations included economic interests. Sorry, I lost my place. Economic interests. A growing understanding of the value of industrial resources in the interior that could feed growing European industrial infrastructures. Power politics, expressed by a desire to get into the empire game before imperial prospects ran out. Think Germany and Belgium. And to avoid a collision of existing empires, think the United Kingdom and France. And then finally, a wish to civilize the dark continent, especially through missionary action. Otto von Bismarck, the first Chancellor of a united Germany, with encouragement from King Leopold II of Belgium, organized a conference in 1884 to bring together the major European players in the second phase of colonial expansion. The purpose was to decide how to handle Africa, that is, how to maximize each other's economic footprint without stepping on each other's feet, given the explosion of interest in this last great colonial prospect. Attendees included Germany, Austria-Hungary, Belgium, Spain, Denmark, France, Britain, Italy, Netherlands, Portugal, Russia, Sweden, Norway, and the Ottoman Empire. In truth, many of the invitees had no serious capability and or interest in acquiring African colonial footholds. Swedish Africa, anyone? The United States was invited and sent a delegation, mainly because of its prior interest in Liberia. Or maybe it was just because of the prospect of free food. Who knows? The United States declined to endorse the outcome of the conference and to sign any final agreements. So it must have been the free food. In late 1884, these countries met in Berlin to begin the carving process. Existing European footholds in Africa were acknowledged and honored, but otherwise, new, mainly superimposed geomorphic and geometrical boundaries were laid down. Why reliance on these boundary types? First, as expected, there was extreme geographical ignorance. Africa was seen as the dark continent for a reason. Apart from knowing the existence of a few major rivers, for example, the Congo Zaire, the Zambezi, the Niger, or the Niger, and a few major landforms, the geography of interior sub-Saharan Africa was a black box to most Europeans. If the Berlin cartographers could use a river for a boundary, then fine, but if not, lines of longitude and latitude were always available and just as good. Second, these types of boundaries were convenient for dealing with the fundamental mission of the conference. To clarify beyond dispute which country continued to control what territory in a world of competitive power politics, thereby minimizing awkward and perhaps deadly confrontations, these types of boundaries were convenient. For example, the French and the Belgians were badly bumping into each other over equatorial Africa and who would control it. They used the Congo-Zaire River to delineate clearly a French, or as a shorthand, Brazzaville, Congo, and a Belgian, or once again shorthand, Kinshasa, Congo, or Leopoldville, Congo, two independent countries that exist today, whose similar names always befuddle my students. Third, and as an aside, these boundary types were occasionally handy to soothe royal European egos. For example, the Germans and the British in 1886 agreed on a straight line separation of German and British East Africa, or current Kenya and Tanzania, or Tanganyika, as it was known at that time. Kaiser Frederick of Germany felt snubbed, yes, shamed, because Mount Kilimanjaro was in the British zone, giving Britain the two highest peaks in Africa, the other being Mount Kenya. Queen Victoria agreed to adjust the straight line boundary so that Mount Kilimanjaro would be in Tanganyika. After all, it was the family thing to do. Frederick was her son-in-law. Queen Victoria's family philanthropy didn't stop with a mountain. In 1890, she agreed to give Germany what is referred to today as the Caprivi Strip, a corruption, as geographers call it, of 100-mile-long neck of land that connected German Southwest Africa, or what's called Namibia today, to the Zambezi River. Frederick thought that it was important for Germany to have access to one of the southern Africa's most important rivers. In a delightful expression of geographic illiteracy, Frederick happily took possession of one of the most difficult ways to access the Zambezi from the west. It is probably an overstatement to say that the conference determined all future African boundaries, but the conference clearly established the values and protocols that legitimized a land grab or a great land robbery alleged by some scholars. Many boundaries were decided through bilateral negotiations in the 20 years that followed the agreement. No African groups were seriously involved in the carving up of Africa unless there was a prior European agreement with African entities that the conference agreed could be considered. At the beginning of the 20th century, probably 90% of Africa was controlled by European countries. The projected map shows very little African territory that is not shown in a pastel color, meaning that all of Africa, almost, was controlled by Europeans. Bismarck and Company had carved the African turkey clean to the bone. The Continental result was massive superimposition of boundaries and consequent overriding of cultures. The map on the screen shows two sets of boundaries. The faint gray lines suggest presumed indigenous boundaries. They actually may have been more like frontiers or zones of transition between tribal domains, but we'll call them boundaries. And the bold lines indicate modern political boundaries. Notice how many bold lines cut through the areas delineated by the gray lines. Look at all the straight lines. One researcher pointed to evidence that 30 to 40% of Africa's new boundaries were straight lines, and that 177 culture areas were partitioned. In brief, very little attention was given to traditional regions in response to European territorial imperatives. Let's look at a couple of specific situations in Africa that illustrate especially well what we may call the Berlin effect. We begin with the land of the indigenous West African Yuwi culture. Technically, this name is pronounced Yu or Yui. I prefer the latter. As indicated on the map, the current Yuwi culture occupies space in Ghana, Togo, and a sliver of southern Benin. At the time of the Berlin Conference, these territories went by the names of the British Gold Coast, Ghana, German Togo, and French Dahomey, or Benin. As a result of the Berlin Agreement, about 80% of Yuwi territory was granted to the British Gold Coast. And as an aside, the Gold Coast was named for its rich gold deposits, but it also became a major area of egress for enslaved persons. The remaining 20% ended up in German Togo. But then World War I happened. It was a world war because fighting erupted outside of Europe, including in the post-Berlin spaces of Africa, pitting Germany against the Western Allies. In 1914, the Germans lost their grip on Togo in the face of British and French military advances. The land of the Yuwis was redistributed so that 60% came under French control and 40% under 60% under British control and 40% under French control. Other adjustments were made after 1919, but regardless, the Germans were no longer players. It should be noted that Germany lost almost all of its African possessions during World War I. In parts of Yuwi land, there is a chance that their culture was subject to British, German, and French influences during the colonial period. There were quite practical consequences. Which European language did you learn? Did you develop the taste for fish and chips, or for something like schnitzel or French wine? Did you have to understand the administrative philosophies of all three countries? And they were quite different on occasion. Superimposed boundaries led to constant cultural imprinting by Europeans that can still be seen. Let's look next at the worm-shaped country full of English speakers called Gambia, lying on the westernmost side of Africa. Geographically, Gambia makes little sense. But given the context of the Berlin Agreement, it makes perfect sense. With a population of 2.5 million, this former British colony lies astride its namesake river, the Gambia River, never wider than 22 miles, but 200 miles long. It's surrounded, save its ocean frontage, by the much larger country of Senegal, a former French colony in which French remains the official language today. Gambia, an important commercial center for the British, was given independence in 1965. Post-independence, British and French statesmen agreed that Gambia should be incorporated into Senegal's hinterland, with the British compensated for the loss of, quote, their territory. Even to the two former colonial competitors, Gambia made no geographical sense. Gambian commercial interests refused adamantly to consider any change in status. There were economic reasons, but clearly Gambians did not want to accept the legacy of a very different French colonial system. We are reminded yet again of the durability of colonial imprints on African populations that came as a part of the superimposition process. Most French and British colonies received independence in the 1950s and 60s. The last European country to release its major colonies was Portugal in the 1970s, often after considerable bloodshed. We are particularly reminded of the strife in Angola. If African boundaries were in fact artificial contrivances of European colonial powers, this surely was the time to set the record straight about borders and the superimposed boundary menace. By and large, that has not happened. In fact, the Organization of African Unity stipulated in 1963 that colonial boundaries should be kept. Members were to accept the sovereignty and territorial integrity of each inherited state. This was an interesting decision by the OAU, given its stated mission of eradicating the effects of colonialism. So what was the OAU thinking? They were acknowledging, in fact, like much of the rest of the world, that the benefits of widespread border adjustment would not be worth the costs, especially the political costs. First, who was going to redraw the boundaries? The OAU? They surely were aware of the meaning of thankless task, given the variety of physical, cultural, and political settings in the affected areas. Second, many of the transcendent human drives regarding space and power were stronger among African leaders than the impulse to rectify old territorial wrongs. The political map of Africa operated on a zero-sum basis. If boundaries were redrawn, one modern country would be forced to cede territory to another country. In the course of modern human history, how often has one sovereign unit willingly handed over territory to another sovereign unit, certainly without reimbursement of some sort? And let's ignore for the moment situations like Alaska and Louisiana. How many power elites in one country have said that they would love to lose their elite status to another country? On a related note, some Africans worried that a restoration of tribal boundaries, such as they were, would be a call to a return to the tribal past that would be detrimental to futures of modernizing African countries attempting to establish national identities. Third, and this is a very practical matter, Europeans colonizers imprinted cultural and economic landscapes on their colonial territories that would have been difficult, very difficult to overcome. Many Africans hated their colonial past, but they often expressed this hatred in English or French or Portuguese. In addition, they were used to colonial administrative philosophies, which often influenced post-colonial structures and practices. Finally, colonial economic flows tended to focus on coastal headland cities, which also became colonial administrative centers and subsequent national capitals. Think of Accra, Ghana, Abidjan in the Ivory Coast, Lagos, Nigeria, although the capital of Nigeria is now Abuja in the interior. Colonizers built railroad networks in these countries that led to these cities. Do you rearrange transportation networks? What if the railroad network of one country is incompatible with the network of another country, maybe because of track gauge? In brief, changing established economic footprints would have been a long and expensive process. Attempts have been made to adjust boundaries. We can think of the Somali dispute with Ethiopia and the Ogaden. Likewise, Western Sahara has experienced decades of distress over where its boundaries should be, especially with Morocco, or if the Sahrawi people should even have a state. And there are other examples, but there has not been a continent-wide clamor to erase superimposed boundaries and to restore the past. In summary, we looked at what a boundary is and how it is classified, at least from the perspective of a political geography person. We naturally crave control over spaces, whether individually or corporately, and that inevitably implies a boundary of some sort. As we noted with reference to post-Berlin Agreement, Africa boundaries can be disruptive. The superimposed boundary can have an especially toxic effect on communities, both in terms of the barrier effect of the boundary itself and the subsequent imprinting of a hegemonic group on the local population within the boundary. Boundaries are still important, however. Try to think of a major international dispute in today's world in which a boundary problem does not figure prominently, or at least is not lurking in the shadows. We may check off Ukraine. The Chinese are stirring up conflicts over their maritime boundaries. Are there any boundary issues associated with the west bank of the Jordan River? Ecuador and Peru in South America spent over 100 years in conflict and occasional war over the Marañón territory. Thankfully, it seems to be largely resolved now. And I suppose there are some possible exceptions, but not many. Boundaries, however, may be increasingly not so important. For travelers, boundaries are virtually meaningless in the Schengen area of Europe. It's tougher to go between the US and Canada. Economic integration makes boundaries for economic reasons largely unnecessary for member states. The EU is a classic example, and this model has spread. When the Organization for African Unity became the African Union in 2002, a fundamental purpose was to promote economic integration at the expense of boundaries. And then there is technology. Boundaries do little to stop TV and radio signals, and it's difficult to stop fully internet transmissions. Modern military technology has made almost useless the motion wall effects of boundaries. I doubt that we will see a day when boundaries cease to exist. Too much historical and cultural baggage to contend with, and contests for space will never disappear, but the work of the political geographer may change. And I implore you, as you're leaving today, make sure to check your personal space and ask yourself the question, how much personal space do I have and do I need? Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for your attention. That's all I have to say. If you have a question, please feel free to ask. I have not been watching the local chat. I can do that, and I would be happy to answer any questions asked in the chat. Okay. I'm not seeing any questions. Okay, Sumo, which may be the most typically violated boundary of all as a practical matter in the world? Oh my goodness. I don't know. There's so many possibilities. In other words, when you say violate, you're talking about militarily violated, you're talking about illegal crossings. I guess that would sort of make a difference. Right now, in a military sense, so we probably need to refer to Ukraine.
How did Colorado get to be a rectangle?
Oh, well, that was just a thing, a matter of convenience in the 19th century. You'll notice that many of the western states have straight lines. New Mexico is an example. Utah, very good example. Uh, not quite so many in Arizona. So it was just that was an easy way to draw a line. Simple enough. Yeah, Wyoming is also rectangular. Okay, Han Island is under dispute between Canada and Denmark. Each year, a party from each country removes the flag of the other country. These are probably risky for the other country's impending visitors who do the same thing. I'm not actually familiar with that dispute, but you've intrigued me here. I may have to become familiar. Well, yeah, Greenland. Uh, are you asking if Greenland is uninhabited, Sumo, or that the other island? Well, Greenland is not uninhabited. They have about 50,000 people in Greenland, mainly on the southwestern coastal area of Greenland. Greenland's history goes back to mainly Nordic roots. And of course, we know the people who moved to Iceland started advertising this new land they found farther to the west, and as sort of a real estate promotion, they called it Greenland. It was everything but green. And Iceland, which has ice in its name, is far greener than Greenland. That's another one of those interesting geographical situations. And uh, uh, as Iceland, Norway, and the others have become under the influence of various Scandinavian powers, Greenland was included. Greenland, really, to my knowledge, does not have any political connections with the formation of North American political units. The U.S. has a military presence in Greenland, Thule Air Force Base in particular, but that's all part of a larger strategic issue. Oh, okay. Han Island. I don't know. Well, in terms of the U.S., oh boy, U.S. and Ukraine, uh, the Ukrainians are inclined to say things like uh, that Kiev is 1,000 years older than Moscow, and the Ukrainians have been around a lot longer than the Great Russians, and we the the justifications used by each side are many and complex. Uh, the Ukrainian claim on the Crimean Peninsula, for example, is a little bit iffy in the sense that in the 1950s, about 1954, the Soviet Union gave the Crimean Peninsula to the Ukrainian SSR, never expecting in the future that the Ukrainian SSR would turn into the sovereign Ukrainian state. Before that time, the Crimean Peninsula really wasn't considered a part of the Ukraine. So, as I say, that the whole Ukrainian situation is very, very difficult.
So far as Crimea, it actually had to do apparently with Khrushchev's wife being Ukrainian and therefore him being friendly towards the Ukrainians, so he gave them a present, you know?
Well,
Yeah.
yeah, and now you see what happened to Khrushchev. Uh, the but that goes to the serendipity way that boundaries can be created and territories can be changed, and that's the royal whim part that I was talking about with regard to Africa. Doesn't have to be just Africa. Any other questions, observations? Okay. Uh, all right. That's one of the most contested parts of the Ukrainian situation. There's a large proportion of the population in the Donbass region, northeastern Ukraine, uh, that is basically Russian. And even if you look at the president of Ukraine today, he grew up as a Russian, speaking Russian as a native language, I believe. When the time came for the Ukraine to vote on whether it was going to become an independent country after 1991, a majority of those Russian speakers in the East voted in favor of becoming an independent country. And so there's a question of what Putin is liberating them from. Uh, the uh, the Putin's using a cultural argument, and it's partly true. This is a Russian-speaking part of the Ukraine, but I think there are other more compelling reasons for Putin. One of which is economic. The Donbass region historically has been an economic powerhouse for the Russian Empire and later the Soviet Union. It's coal and iron and so forth that made this into a smokestack industry region. I think the other region, which may be more compelling, is that Putin has a desire to reconstitute the Russian Empire, and he thinks that territories that changed after 1991, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, were unfairly given independence by the rest of the world. So there's a claim out there for restoration that Putin is making, and I would disagree with that because those territories were all the subjects of conquest by the Russian Empire. So I don't want to get off in a long discussion about the Ukraine, but it's a very complex situation. Yeah, well, there is a German claim to the Ukraine. Uh, German farmers migrated to Ukraine over time uh, to support Ukrainian agricultural uh, uh, reinvention of some sort. So yeah, if you look at one of Karl Haushofer's maps of German influence, it includes parts of Ukraine. Wow, I didn't know we would talk about Eastern Europe. I'm always glad to. Any other questions? Okay, I will give you the gift of time, 4 minutes early. Thank you again for joining me this morning. It's been great, and thank you for letting us, a social scientist, human geographer like me, participate in the presentations. All right, have a great weekend.